Hello, my name is Neil Morgan. I'm your York County Administrator. Joining me today are our two Deputy County Administrators, Vivian McGettigan and Mark Carter. The purpose of our show today is to talk with you about our plans for the upcoming FY 16-17 operating budget. When you're talking about an operating budget in local government, just give us a little sense of some of the major elements of an operating budget, ours or any other one for that matter.
Well, York is very similar to many other counties that are approximately our size. The most significant amount of our budget is spent on education. Education includes not only our transfer to the school division, but it also includes our libraries. The second largest part of our budget is our public safety area. And in public safety, that includes the sheriff's staff, as well as fire and life safety, and our emergency communications staff, and the radio towers that go with that, and equipment that goes with that as well. The next largest area is our public works department. Recently, two departments were merged, our general services and our environmental services, to create our public works area, and they represent 7% of the budget. So when you add all of that together, we basically have 25% remaining in our operating budget, and that covers the remainder of our constitutional officers, our Commissioner of Revenue, Treasurer, the court system with the Commonwealth Attorney, as well as Parks and Recreation, all of our support departments, finance, IT, and human resources. So as you can see, there are a lot of departments that are represented in that 25%. That also covers any debt service we may have on any outstanding debt for both the county and the schools.
And we'll want to talk about that a little bit more when we turn to the capital budget. Just to step back for a second, and to, at the risk of repeating, so clearly education and public safety are the big two. That's yes. Your main point. Mm-hmm. And then the operational components of the county, what we now call public works, and then pretty much everything else. Mm-hmm. People might be wondering, just sort of order of magnitude, how big is the county's budget? Not holding due to an exact number, but just to give people a sense of it.
Well, when you look just at our operating budget, we're around $130 million, a little okay. more than that. And that covers the transfer to the schools. That does not cover the schools' budget itself.
And so that's what a lot of people would call the general fund, mm-hmm. sort of the main yes. activities of the government. And sometimes it's a little bit confusing when people are trying to understand our finances. It's even confusing to us because there are many funds, and you have internal service funds like vehicle services where we charge back for the cost of vehicles. Mm-hmm. You have enterprise funds where fees are charged, such as with the sewer fund or solid mm-hmm. waste. And so there's some other elements. But typically when we're talking about expenditures, we tend to talk about that $133 million mm-hmm. figure and relate it to the general fund. So that's kind of how we spend the money, broad brush, by functional category. Mm-hmm. I think another way to think about how we spend money is what kind of things do we spend the money on? Could you sort of take a shot at answering it that way?
Absolutely. Well, in our general fund budget, the first expense off the bat is our transfer to the schools. They're our number one priority here in the county, and that represents 38% of our budget. And then we also have our salaries and benefits for the staff that are in all of the county departments that are charged to our operating fund, and that is another 35% of our budget. And from there, we have debt service, which is 7%, and then the remainder of that goes for everything else that we spend money on here. It's the utilities to keep the buildings going, it's the general maintenance within those buildings, it's the small equipment that we have, it's supplies and operations, it's the insurance on our facilities. And so, as you can see, the vast majority, once you remove the school division from the rest of the general fund, the vast majority of our budget goes to salaries and benefits for the staff who work in our.
And of course, even if you were slicing and dicing the school part of the budget, just like much of the expenditure of general county services is for people, because we're in the people business, the same would apply to the school dollars. If you took those school dollars or other dollars they get from state and federal sources, the vast majority of their expenditures for people as well.
In fact, I had not calculated that, but my guess would be theirs would be even higher because of the emphasis on the teachers that are in the classrooms and the staff that are in the classes.
And Mark, just a comment, on your experience when you had to, come up with a recommended budget last year, and everybody's always conscious about being efficient and keeping costs under control. Doesn't in many ways it kind of comes down to staffing?
Does, absolutely. And we didn't have any requests for additional staffing last year, which is unusual. Some years there have been requests for multiple new staff positions. We knew we needed to hold the line last year and try to do what needs to be done with the existing staffing levels that we had. And it puts a crunch on everybody because everybody works harder.
Waiting for me.
Absolutely.
Yes,
that's
right.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the expenditure side, and obviously the other side of the operating budget is where the money comes from. Tax revenues, fees, transfers from other levels of government, state and federal government. At a high level, would you comment a little bit about that? Where's the money come from?
Well, our general fund is primarily funded by our real estate. It represents about 50% of our budget, and just as a point of reference, 75% of that comes from our residential properties, and about another 25% comes from our commercial and industrial areas. Personal property taxes, which are all of the vehicles that we have in the county, that represents 11% of our budget, so that's our next largest funding source. We also receive 10% of our funding from the state, and that funding comes by way of grants as well as funding for our constitutional officers. Some people are not aware, but the state actually funds our sheriff as well as some of the sheriff's staff and the Commissioner of Revenue, Treasurer, Commonwealth Attorney, and the Clerk's Office all receive a portion of that. And so we watch very carefully as this week, we're in December right now, the governor will be releasing his budget later in the week, so we'll be watching very closely to see what those impacts may be, because that's one that is harder for us to predict as the budget process goes through. But again, it's 10% of our budget.
Well, and just to make the point again, while we're always talking about this revenue source and that revenue source and what's happening, the folks are probably looking at a graph during some of this discussion. In local government in Virginia, whether you're a wealthy community or a not so wealthy community, a lot of it does still boil down to the real estate tax. And in your county, that's even a little bit more true than some other places. Mark, I know you've been working on our legislative priorities at the state level. Would you care to give a couple of examples of why, under the rules of the state, the county kind of has a different set of rules than say than a city when it comes to raising money?
Well, there are some examples of that. Yes, cities do enjoy some taxing authorities. Cities and towns enjoy some taxing authorities that counties don't have. The two primary examples are the cigarette tax and the admissions tax, both of which could generate pretty significant amounts of revenue that would help supplement the revenue available from the more traditional ones like the real estate and personal property.
And the third one I would add is the meals tax, because while we have a meals tax in York County, by state rule, counties can only have a 4-cent meals tax, whereas our neighboring cities can have whatever tax they want. Point being, not whether we have that particular tax, but we can't even talk about it. We don't have the right to think about it. So when we have a revenue need, we're pretty much forced to go to property tax because that's where the money is, at least the way the rules are currently.
And even when we have been granted some of those additional taxes like the meals tax or the lodging tax, the General Assembly has seen fit to put some restrictions on it. For example, saying that a certain percentage of that revenue has to be spent on a specific purpose as opposed to being available for general county purposes.
So the reality is, since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, trends in local government revenue have looked a lot different than if you were drawing those same graphs 7, 8 years ago.
Yes.
Go ahead and comment.
And we do actually draw those graphs. While we only mentioned a few of our revenues, we actually have over 200 revenue codes that we do actually track. And so very generally, in 2009, everything was good here in York, and we saw very drastic drop-offs in some of our revenues during that time. The state also encountered similar issues. We also lost a major real estate taxpayer during that time. So that's had some impacts.
That's the refinery?
So when you look back 7 years and you think about the county budget, the county's budget, when you remove the school portion of it, is actually down 3% from where it was in 2009. And the school division 7 years later is only up 3%. And those two don't actually tie to each other because, I mean, it's more complicated because of other funding. But
the schools
really,
have taken a big hit
they
from the
have
state.
taken a large hit, and the county has
Tried to do
assisted as best they can. Both sides really have suffered through that. So 7 years later, when you look at inflation having been 14% during that, about 2% per year, to be down 3% and then to only be up 3% on the school side has had an
Right.
impact on services.
So your point being that's before any adjustment for inflation.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
In real dollars, probably the county's spending at about 25% lower than it was before the recession. Now, some folks will listen to that and say, okay, that sounds good. That sounds like we've made efficiencies, we've tightened our belt, both on the county side and the school side. Fair enough. But let's talk just a little bit about those efficiencies. How does your county compare to other places? Because one of the things I noticed when I came to work here is if you look at your county compared to comparable communities in Hampton Roads, we have a lesser number of employees per capita. We have low levels of debt. We have low levels of expenditure per capita.
Well, Neil, I actually have a slide which I think we're going to be sharing with those who are watching this, which shows our traditional performance measures. The reason I like these is because they're objective measures, because it's comparing us to others using very consistent financial data. So, for example, when we look at our real estate tax rate, we're at 75.15 cents, and as you can see on the chart, we're down on the right-hand side, so only a couple are lower than us in our regional area. When you look at local government employees per capita, we are actually at 10, which is tied with James City at the lowest number of employees that we hire in order to provide service to our citizens. Another way to look at that is what do we actually just simply spend dollar-wise to provide services? And those we go through to make sure we're comparing with our other jurisdictions. So for example, cities, we take the road piece out of that as we're comparing. But as you can see on this, we're the lowest in the region in providing those services, which again leads to efficiency. We believe, all of the employees here believe we provide very high quality services. This is just a way of showing that we do it a little less expensively, a little more efficiently than our comparable peers.
Well, and certainly in the time I've been here, I've noticed that I would have to say our staffing's a little bit on the thin side compared to my previous experience. And without getting into all those details, what those graphs show are for any community that has the density of York County, we provide the local government services pretty inexpensively. We compare quite favorably by any reasonable measure of efficiency. We mentioned in passing, we were talking about what has happened with school funding, in particular related to the state. And Mark, I see you've got that open to that graph. Would you just put a real dollar term on what's happened in sort of the local state funding mix for our public schools in recent years?
Well, just in general, the state funding has gone down and the county's picked up the slack. It has had to do that to compensate for the drop in state funding that's available to the schools. And the Board of Supervisors has done a really good job of recognizing that as a priority and stepping up to the plate and diverting additional county revenue to the school system.
And probably just about everybody watching the show would say York County prides itself on the quality of its schools and the quality of its outcomes. And I think probably everyone feels good that the county has stepped it up. But there is a certain reality if you're in my situation, and I'm thinking about the rest of the county operations and how we pay the bill. The simple fact is, since the Great Recession, the county has increased expenditures to the schools by over $6 million, and the state has decreased expenditures to our schools in your county by almost $5 million. That's a major swing. And if I had that $6 million, we could do a lot of things on the county side. But that is our reality, and we hope, and working as a team with the school system, we've been making a lot of noise at the state level. It's time for the state to step up and do what needs to be done to fund our public schools and take a little of the pressure off of local government. And that's really not just a York County thing, that's all around the Commonwealth of Virginia. I think maybe it's time to sort of wrap this with a little summary of how interested citizens can follow what's going to happen with the operating budget process. Vivian, I'll give you a chance to sort of hit the highlights. Between now and May, what should folks be watching for?
Well, on January 19th, that is the opportunity for citizens to come and speak to the board in the public forum. And then in February, the Board of Supervisors will have a joint meeting with the school board, at which point they will share issues as both the Board of Supervisors and the school board work on developing the budgets. From March 1st through the end of April, there are 7 work sessions basically scheduled with the board on various topics that have not been identified yet. The board will identify what some of those topics are. We'll make some recommendations to them as well.
And probably some of those things we were just talking about, the relationship between the capital budget, compensation, what's going on with schools.
And of course, most excitingly, on March 15th, our County Administrator Neil Morgan will be presenting his proposed budget. And April 21st is another important date for the citizens, because that's the opportunity for public comment on the tax rate as well as on the budget. And the board will consider all of the various issues that have been presented from the proposed budget through the work sessions, through the public comment, to then on May 3rd, that is the date that is scheduled for the board to approve the tax rates as well as the upcoming budget.
Well, I think we've covered this topic with some thoroughness. Hopefully you found this summary of our operating budget environment for 2016-2017 to be informative. On the screen as this show ends is the information about how to contact the county, the staff, as well as the Board of Supervisors. We encourage you to monitor the process as we proceed to conclude a successful budget process in the spring of 2016. Thanks for your interest, and have a good day.